Poecilotheria regalis, known commonly as the Indian ornamental, is a large, old-world arboreal tarantula. With its impressive leggy build and striking pattern, it is no surprise that this tarantula is as popular as it is. All of these Poecilotheria species are native to India and Sri Lanka. While many of the species in this genus do look quite similar in appearance to the untrained eye, there are subtle ways that we can tell them apart. While the coloration and pattern of the Indian ornamental bears a very similar appearance to many others, this is the only species that sports a pink band on the underside of the abdomen. Females of this tarantula can sometimes exceed 7.5 inches in wingspan, and it is not uncommon to have ones that push the 8-inch mark. Even males, while notably smaller, can still reach an impressive 6 inches or more in wingspan, which is quite large for a male tarantula. This species, like all Poecilotherias, are sexually dimorphic once they hit a certain size, and mature males are very easily to tell apart from females just from looking at the coloration alone. This tarantula has been observed in the wild living in very close proximity to other individuals, and therefore some folks do consider them to be communal, and indeed there have been many success stories of hobbyists keeping multiple adults in a large terrarium with little to no cannibalism. That being said, however, these are not really considered a true communal species like in the case of the M. balfouri or the Socotra Island blue baboon, which has actually been observed sharing food and even feeding its young. So with these, there is still a real possibility of you coming home to find all but one really fat spider gone from your enclosure. And I say this not to try and deter anyone, but when you consider the fact that these are not exactly cheap tarantulas, there is most certainly a financial risk associated with keeping these species communally. The P. regalis has a much lighter cream-colored body, which helps differentiate it from certain other Poecilotherias, such as the P. ornata or the fringe ornamental, which has a much darker complexion. The abdomen features a beautiful ornamental pattern, which gives the tarantula its name, and the carapace has various purple and black highlights, with the legs being adorned with a variety of yellow, black, and gray stripes. The bottoms of the first two pairs of legs are bright lemon yellow with black bands, which are shown anytime the tarantula rears up into a threat pose. Although it is not a particularly defensive species, the venom of the P. regalis, as with all pokies, is medically significant, and is considered to be amongst the most potent of all tarantula species. Intense muscle cramping, nausea, and accelerated heartbeat are just some of the symptoms that one can experience from a bite. In addition, symptoms are said to last for days or sometimes even weeks after the initial bite. So if we combine their incredible speed and rather nervous temperament with their potent venom, this does make them far more suitable for experienced hobbyists. I definitely would not recommend attempting to handle one of these tarantulas, ever. As I said, they would much rather flee than put up a fight, and are honestly a lot less likely to bite than most of the baboon tarantulas I have owned, but would still likely do so if they were cornered. My girl seems to be a tad on the ornery side. In fact, you guys probably saw that video where I first got her, and she actually spun around and bit the paintbrush I was attempting to coax her out with. This is personally the only individual of this species I have owned that has shown that sort of behavior. Most of the other ones were just super flighty, but not all that defensive. But that just goes to show you the amount of variation in temperament when it comes to individual tarantulas. These are arboreal tarantulas, and in the wild are typically found up in trees, or at least above ground level. However, when young, they do oftentimes like to burrow into the substrate. So I give my spiderlings and my juveniles a good bit more substrate in their enclosures. As they grow, they seem to leave the ground more and gradually become more and more arboreal, I still house all sizes in an arboreal setup with a tall enclosure with plenty of cross ventilation, and provide them some type of branch or log which I lean against one side of the enclosure, and this provides them with something to climb on as well as to web against. Adults will create a vertical web tube, usually behind their decor, and will attach chunks of substrate and moss to it in order to help camouflage their webbing. Slings and juvies will web quite extensively. However, adult pokies don't seem to web quite as prolifically as certain other arboreals, and are often out on display more often. That being said, they can still be quite shy at times and are very photosensitive, meaning that they do not like light. Usually, if a light is shined on my girl, she'll immediately freeze and will actually use her coloration to try and blend in with her surroundings. Feeding time is always a ton of fun when it comes to these guys, and mine rarely passes up a meal unless she is close to a molt. These can take on large crickets and adult roaches with little to no trouble, although we must of course bear in mind the size of the individual tarantula we are feeding in comparison to the prey item. That way we don't wind up over-challenging our tarantula. While I personally don't feed any of my tarantula's vertebrates, I could totally see this girl taking on small lizards and pinkies without much trouble. Weirdly enough, despite being a tree-dwelling species, my P. regalis seems to favor superworms above all else. I usually give her 2 of these, or 3 or 4 large crickets every 1 to 2 weeks, depending on how recently her last molt was, as well as her abdomen size. While the P. regalis does come from a rainforest environment, and thus appreciates a good bit of humidity, they can still be quite tolerant of drier conditions. I keep her water dish full at all times and will mist one side of the enclosure every few days. This is a pretty hardy spider, even as a spiderling, and once we get them past second instar, where they're a bit more vulnerable and prone to desiccation, they're honestly very, very low maintenance. I'm sure some of you who are regulars on this channel have noticed that I don't really discuss numbers a whole lot when it comes to humidity and moisture, and that's really just because it's a very gray area, honestly, when it comes to captain care and husbandry of our spiders. And in addition to this, I have observed that a lot of newer keepers will literally obsess over keeping their humidity at a certain percentage, and in some cases end up killing their spiders because they essentially oversaturate the enclosure while not allowing it to dry out in between, or just simply don't provide enough ventilation, and this leads to a very moist and stuffy environment that more or less can suffocate your tarantula. So really, if you have a large enough water dish and you make sure to keep it full all the time, that's probably all the humidity that you really need. Now, you could still wet the substrate or even spray the webbing every so often to sort of spike that humidity, but there's really no need to go crazy with it. I personally have never bred P. regalis before, but I have read that they're quite easy to breed in captivity, and sacs typically produce between 150 and 300 spiderlings. Overall, if you've got some experience with old world species, or even some of the faster and more spunky new world tarantulas, and you are looking for something a bit more exotic, then the Indian ornamental is definitely the tarantula for you. Well, arachnoholics, that's all for this time. Thank you all for watching, and please make sure to check out my Patreon, as well as my other social media in the description below. Adios!